Hi, everyone, and welcome to this podcast episode of Caribbean Connections. My name is Adrian Alexander. I'm with Free the Slaves, the Secretariat of the Caribbean Coalition Against Trafficking in Persons. And today I have the pleasure of being joined by my colleague on the Leadership Committee, Dr. Cherisse Francis. Cherisse, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Cherisse. I am one of the members of the CCATIP Steering Committee, and I'm really happy to be here. This is my life's work. This is my baby, research and trafficking in persons. Super excited about the new UNODC report. So we'll talk about that a little bit today.
Excellent. And as Cherisse said, we are here to discuss the UNODC's GLOTIP report that was published in December. And with us, we have Sharifa Ammon of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. Sharifa, would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about who is Sharifa.
Hi, Adrian and Cherisse. Thank you so much for having me again. I'm very happy to be here on today's episode. I am an attorney at law. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. I've previously worked in the sphere of human trafficking and child protection in Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm currently based in Barbados with the UNODC's Regional Office for Central America and the Caribbean. At UNODC, I work with the Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling section, and this section works to prevent and address human trafficking and migrant smuggling in the region through capacity building initiatives, as well as providing technical assistance and fostering collaboration between regional governments, civil society organizations, as well as other international partners.
Okay, so you have a lot on your plate.
Yes, of course.
But thanks so much for taking the time to join us today, and welcome. And just give us a little background of what are these GLOTIP reports? I mean, what is the purpose of them? When did it start? And maybe a few highlights of the most recent report.
Okay, great. So the UNODC GLOTIP report is a biennial publication. This is the 8th edition. The first edition was in 2009. And it is really aimed at enhancing the global understanding of trafficking patterns, improving the effectiveness of anti-trafficking measures, as well as fostering international cooperation. So essentially, the report provides data-driven insights, which we know very important, into trafficking in persons, or TIP. It analyzes the trends in trafficking in persons, as well as victim profiles and the methods that traffickers are currently using. It's based on information that is provided by the member states, as well as research that is conducted by UNODC. And of course, the report also provides actionable recommendations to states and the various stakeholders. It serves as a really critical resource that is much needed to all of the stakeholders involved in anti-trafficking efforts. So the overview of the 2024 GLOTIP report, of course, is building on the previous reports, and it's really emphasizing the evolving nature of trafficking. So the key themes that we're seeing currently are the impact of conflict and climate change on trafficking. It highlights how these really impact the vulnerabilities of persons, particularly women and other marginalized groups. We are seeing the trend of the role of technology in trafficking in persons. There's an increase in forced criminality and online scamming, and we're exploring how traffickers are exploiting the digital platforms for recruitment and exploitation, while also looking at the benefits and the potential of technology in prevention and victim identification.
Awesome. So between 2022 and 2024, what are some of the major changes that you've seen take place that the report would highlight?
Again, of course, internationally, we look at regionally afterwards, but internationally, we're finally seeing an increase in victim identification and efforts coming out of the pandemic. And of course, the rise of technology, as I indicated before, in the TIP sphere. So trafficking in 2009, when the report first came out, and trafficking in 2024 is vastly different. And we're seeing those trends now.
Great. I think one of the things that leapt out for me in the presentation that was done by the head of the UNODC about this report is how the forced labor, trafficking for forced labor, has risen to above that of sex trafficking, you know, because so very often we make a lot of media coverage surrounding sex trafficking. So I love that the report captures that. So it gives us an idea of how we need to be adjusting our focus as civil society or as academics or as government stakeholders. And one thing that was really scary for me was the rise in child trafficking and how steadily that is increasing. I think the report makes reference to it has tripled in the last 15 years. And I was chatting with some students the other day, and they didn't seem to understand that they were the ones in focus of traffickers, you know? And I think that it shook me to know that this has tripled over the last 15 years. And it really gives me some impetus to say, we need to have, just as we're focusing on survivor-informed approaches, we need to get our youth and their voices involved in this. Just as so many young people are involved in the climate change crisis and so many other things, I think we really need to do a lot more to involve young people. Thanks so much for that overview, Sharifa. I'll turn over to Cherisse. I know she has some questions.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you so much, Sharifa, for that. And I must say, I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk about the report with you as an expert, as one of the UNODC people, because for me, as a researcher who spent so long looking at anti-trafficking and trafficking in the Caribbean, data is always one of the things that's hard to find. As a region, we don't get to see our numbers. We don't often get to understand. Stakeholders oftentimes don't know what's out there. So I would encourage anybody, have a look at the UNODC GLOTIP reports. They really are helpful and they break down the information in really accessible ways. So my first question for you, having had a look at this new report, one of the things that was noticeable for me was a significant drop in the detection of victims identified in the region since pre-COVID times. So do you think, or based on the research conducted for the report, is that the result of a lull in detection efforts? So for example, police officers refocusing anti-trafficking efforts perhaps to keep people off the streets because of COVID? Or do you think from the research that it was more a drop in opportunities for exploitation because people were off the streets, not traveling as much as a result of COVID?
Okay, yeah, so according to the GLOTIP 2024, the regional statistics for the Caribbean and Central America, because we're grouped together, there was a 53% decline in victim detection, right? Yeah, and that is very concerning. So this significant drop in identification for the region is likely a result of a combination of factors rather than, just one singular cause. Some of the factors that are worth highlighting include that in the post-pandemic era, governments have really been readjusting and adapting to the evolving nature of the crime, which has undergone significant changes since the pandemic itself, As a result, the proactive victim identification measures have become a little bit more challenging. Of course, during the pandemic, there were limited physical operations, and that has impacted the interagency collaboration. Therefore, it's hindering efforts such as raids and inspections at high-risk locations. Additionally, we're seeing limited resources dedicated to addressing trafficking in persons, which have further strained the efforts to identify and really support victims effectively. Of course, now traffickers have always been adapting, to new methods, and they're taking advantage of the evolving circumstances, such as online exploitation, which is heavily featured throughout the 2024 report. So COVID restrictions did sort of significantly curtail opportunities for certain forms of trafficking, and there was a sharp decline in travel and closed borders, as well as the physical movement of traffickers and their victims, right? The economic downturns, example, the lockdowns, of course, in tourism, which our region really heavily relies on, and is heavily used for traffickers, that was on a decrease. So now we are seeing that these disruptions that did provide some of the explanation. However, despite the disruptions, the reports also indicate that there's a notable increase in online exploitation and recruitment. So of course, traffickers are finding new methods of recruiting and exploiting persons, and their ability to adapt to the digital space is of concern, of course. So another factor is that the pandemic may have exacerbated the pre-existing gaps in victim identification infrastructure, and then there was the decreased funding for anti-trafficking units and fewer training programs for law enforcement, as well as other, limitations. And victims who are already a very vulnerable population may have been harder to reach due to all of the different restrictions. However, it's very important for us to note that based on the research, the decline in victims detected may not actually reflect a decrease in trafficking in persons, but rather the reduced capacity to identify victims. And if we look at the GLOTIP from 2022, that report also indicated that there was a little evidence to suggest that the threat of TIP had diminished, with the drop in detected victims. And other research conducted by UNODC also highlighted that crises, conflicts, and climate emergencies actually escalate the trafficking risk. So as we note in 2024's GLOTIP, the marked decrease in detection of victims during the pandemic, there's been a number of, globally, not in our region, there has been an increase again in detection, suggesting that the decrease that we saw globally during the pandemic is not really a reflection of limited victims, it's just the circumstances of the pandemic.
Thank you so much for that. And I think you hit so many interesting points there. I think one of the ones I just want to touch on a bit is the fact that when people are looking at these reports, they have to understand what they're seeing. So the reports will always say number of victims identified or number of victims detected. And that doesn't mean that's all the people that might have been trafficked, but those are the ones that have been formally processed through the systems or that have been identified by different governmental procedures to say, this is who we recognize as a trafficked person in this time and space. And that's so important. But also connecting back to what Adrian had said earlier, where there's more technology involved, I'm thinking, perhaps that's why we're seeing the rise in the number of children being trafficked as well, because that's a big online community. But definitely interesting points to ponder, which leads us then a little bit to the second question I had for you. So the report mentions that criminal justice systems take 1 year longer to convict for forced labor when compared to sexual exploitation. And we know that in the Caribbean region, one of the big things for us is the backlog of our court systems and criminal justice systems. So is this length of time the same based on what the report said or UNODC research for the Caribbean, this 1 year longer for forced labor than sexual exploitation?
So unfortunately, the GLOTIP 2024 report does not provide specific data comparing the time taken to secure convictions for the Caribbean region. Earlier on we talked about the issues of a lack of data for our region. That is something we have to work on. However, the report highlights that globally, the convictions for forced labor tend to take longer than those for sexual exploitation, approximately a year longer. So the case analysis by UNODC suggests that on average, it takes about 3 years to convict a trafficker for forced labor compared to 2 years for trafficking for sexual exploitation. And this is attributed to the complexity of forced labor cases, because they involve a broader network of exploitation and hidden operations and less tangible evidence compared to sexual exploitation cases. And traditionally, trafficking for sexual exploitation is the most detected form of TIP in the Caribbean region. According to GLOTIP 2024, 62% of all victims detected regionally were for sexual exploitation, compared to about 22% for forced labor and 16% for other forms of exploitation. So the challenges that we see globally with prosecutor and trafficking cases are also exacerbated in the Caribbean by our limited resources, low detection rates, and the very same case backlogs that you spoke about. The lack of specialized prosecutors, for example, as well, and compounded by the unfamiliarity with forced labor cases. So if we see that 62% of the victims are usually for sexual exploitation, we have more experience in that in the region. So these systemic issues, along with limited regional data on forced labor cases, suggest that the patterns globally could also be amplified within the Caribbean region.
Thank you for that. And I love that you said we need to do better on data in the Caribbean. And I also want to echo that and push a challenge to the stakeholders. We need to do better on data to make sure that in the future, the UNODC reports have too much Caribbean data to put in so that we can have even deeper discussions on this. So the next question is, what do you think we can glean or take away from this 2024 report about changing trends that we might be seeing in the Caribbean?
Okay, so we're definitely seeing an increase in the number of children, both boys and girls, being detected. Girls now account for approximately 52% of all detected victims, and this is, increasing. And this suggests, again, the heightened vulnerability of our girls and our children. We are seeing differences in the gender patterns in forced labor. So we have some increase in the amount of victims who are detected in forced labor cases. And again, women and girls also represent the largest share of those victims, with women being 37% and girls being 32%. However, we have boys, so they are not left out. The men account for 16% and boys 15%. So there's a broader gender inclusion in forced labor as compared to sexual exploitation. On a positive note, we have a 3% increase in convictions for trafficking persons. So it's been 3% since the COVID-19 pandemic, which suggests some level of recovery in the criminal justice response, though this progress might be a little bit modest, given that there was a 70% drop during the pandemic. The majority of convicted persons in trafficking cases are citizens of the country where they were prosecuted, reflecting the localized nature of trafficking operations in the Caribbean. Another trend that we can look at as well is the trafficking structures. So in the Caribbean, trafficking operations range from individual actors, so one trafficker, to small groups, to organized criminal groups that are more business-like structures. So there's diversity in the trafficking operations and organization, which sort of reflects the adaptability of traffickers to evade detection and expand their operations. Another thing for us to look at as well is the transnational trafficking patterns. So most of the victims in the Caribbean are either nationals of the region or from neighboring countries. So we do note that there is a significant number of victims from South America who are trafficked within the Caribbean. However, there's trafficking within the Caribbean region from neighboring countries and islands.
Thank you so much again, Sharifa. And I think, again, you made some really important points there. And I think one of the things for me that was interesting was the fact that trafficking cases went up during COVID. And that's surprising for the Caribbean region, but actually we did quite well in terms of switching to online courts. And you're in Adrian's home country, Trinidad, was actually one of the countries at the forefront of that for the Caribbean that recognized, listen, we've got to be responsive to this pandemic. How do we get our court systems online quickly to still run through some of our cases? So that was helpful. And I wonder if that impacted in the way that we were able to see prosecutions and some convictions secured even during the pandemic for trafficking. So that was super helpful. So my next question then is, what are some of the steps that Caribbean non-state actors, so actors that are not governments, can take to help improve the quantity, one, and secondly, the quality of Caribbean data for the next report? So again, we go back to this question of data.
Yes, simply put, there's strength in numbers, and those of us who work in the sphere of work with anti-trafficking efforts are familiar with the 3 Ps and now the 4 Ps: prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnership. And the partnership is really where non-state actors can contribute greatly by lending their support and their expertise, developing partnerships with government agencies, conducting research, because we know we need a lot of research to lead and strategize our anti-trafficking efforts. So we could collaborate with studies evaluating trafficking trends, as well as complementing the quantitative data. Advocacy, again, is very, very important. And not just advocacy related to public awareness and victim care, but advocacy for better data collection and publication of data trends that a lot of our regional organizations and state organizations collect, but the public is not able to access. We can also see that non-state actors can help with building capacity of different stakeholders, so training programs for local NGOs and journalists and other actors for data collection, trafficking detection, and ethical reporting, and of course, sharing all of the information that is collected, or that is all the research that non-state actors have, sharing them widely and inclusively with international agencies, the government agencies, and so that we really have stronger partnerships. So by taking all of these steps, the non-state actors can play a really vital role in ensuring that future reports very accurately reflect the trends and challenges in the region, while also strengthening the overall response to TIP.
Thank you so much for that. And one of the final questions we have for you. So given the focus and the acknowledgement in this last 2024 report that most detected victims originate from Africa, is there any research being done into the connection between Africa and the Caribbean as it relates to the transatlantic slave trade and how that might have impacted now trafficking in persons? I love this question because it concerns history and culture and still modern day and everything that's going on. So I'm very curious to hear your response.
Yeah, and this is definitely a great question and a very good opportunity. So I'm aware that there's academic research being conducted. However, at this time, there's no research being conducted on this theme by UNODC itself. It's a fantastic opportunity to raise the suggestion because this is, our region has this history of slavery and trafficking. So it's worth noting. And again, to highlight that we need to collaborate as we're seeing, all of these trends internationally. And yeah, it really underscores the importance of strengthening our response through collaboration. So very wonderful question. No research being done at this time by UNODC, but there is research being done by other partners.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And yes, I'm interested because it's actually one of my research areas. It's one of the things that I'm writing a paper on currently. So that should be quite interesting.
Great.
So I will hand over to Adrian now. Thank you so much for entertaining my questions and being here with me, Adrian.
Thanks so much, Cherisse and Sharifa. Are there any other things that we may not have asked that you think the public would need to know or should know about the contents of the 2024 GLOTIP report?
Oh, I definitely say that I'm always excited and looking forward to people understanding and learning more about trafficking in persons. So I just encourage persons to actually read the report and find out how they could, lend their voice in support and in collaboration with all of the wonderful anti-trafficking efforts that are being executed throughout the region.
Thank you so much, Sharifa. Thank you so much, Cherisse, for joining us on Caribbean Connections. And of course, thanks going out to Lizette and the entire team at UNODC's regional office for just making this possible. So looking forward to speaking with you and other colleagues in the near future on some other topics. But this will be a wrap up for us on Caribbean Connections, and see you soon.